get started. A lot to talk about, but I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited that you're here. Hope you're excited as well. My name is Monica Grover, and I am a public affairs specialist at the FBI. And today I'm going to talk about having a government podcast and using our show inside the FBI is kind of a case study to walk you through what it's like to start one and what it's like to kind of produce an episode from start to finish. I recognize there are a lot of different agencies, size-wise, budget-wise, and all that sort of good stuff. So I'll try my best to kind of help you out no matter where you are. But first I want to see, does anyone's agency already have a podcast? Okay, a few of you, awesome. Anyone looking to start one, or maybe looking that they don't want to, trying to convince someone not to do one? Okay. Is anyone in the wrong talk and want to gracefully exit now? That's also an option, I won't be offended. But okay, first, I do work for the FBI, so here is your friendly FBI disclaimer. Neither I, Monica, nor the FBI endorse any product, software, platform, tool, etc. that I may name specifically. I do tend to be fairly general through this talk, but if you do have any questions about specifics, definitely let me know and I can let you know. There you go, there's my disclaimer. If you take anything out of this, it's that the FBI, just like everyone else in the middle of the pandemic, decided to launch a podcast. At the time, it didn't feel that way, but looking back, it's like, yeah, we did that just with everyone else. So real quick, I just want to introduce you to my team. I work in the FBI.gov unit, and we handle web and social media for the FBI. So we are external, public-facing, public-focused. Our team has writers, editors, web content managers, videographers, photographers. We have a wide range of skill sets and employee types. And for 10, 15 years now, we've been pushing out stories and videos on our website and on our social channels. But one thing we never really had was a true podcast, and that was kind of a gap that we identified and filled in 2020. To give you a quick history of the show, it was originally radio spots. So like 1 to 5 minutes, and it went out to local radio stations, and that was the objective of what was being done at that time, was to get on local radio. Having it on Apple as a podcast was kind of secondary, and like, okay, we have these audio files, we'll get them out on Apple. But we didn't get a lot of feedback on listenership or effectiveness with these radio spots. And we had the opportunity in 2020, when the individual who's doing the radio spots moved on from the Bureau, to kind of take this inside the FBI show and turn it from radio spots that you might hear in traffic to an actual podcast that you would listen to on Spotify or some such. So you might be thinking, well, you guys already had a podcast. So we sort of had a tiny head start, but I do want to emphasize that we really looked at this as starting from scratch to build a real long-form show from top to bottom. I would say the only things we really started with were the name inside the FBI and already having an Apple account. Otherwise, we really worked together as a team to kind of push this out as something brand new. So why did we want to do this? First and foremost, a lot of us on our team really love podcasts. I've been listening to podcasts for more than 10 years at this point, and when there was an opportunity to kind of volunteer for something at work that I was passionate about outside of work, I really jumped at that chance. So having gone through this whole process and producing this show for a little over 2 years now, that passion and that love for podcasts is really important. It's the one thing at work that I do that I really do love. But it also gave us an opportunity to tell our stories in a new way and to reach an audience we may not be reaching otherwise. We can write a story, we can put out a press release, we can put out a tweet, but there may be a whole bunch of people who are never consuming that type of content, but maybe they'll find us somehow in their podcast platform. So that was sort of our idea there. We also saw it as something that we could package with other content. Maybe we write a story, but we still have this audio interview that we could repurpose into a podcast and put it all together as one big package. That's great, the more the merrier. And podcasts also give us resources we can use in the future. We, back in January, did a podcast episode on combating human trafficking, and that was back in January, and recently, I believe in early August it was, we had a pretty sizable operation across the country with the FBI focused on human trafficking recovery. And we were able to use the podcast as a, hey, learn more about our efforts to combat human trafficking. So they're not just kind of one and done sorts of things. They're something we can go back to at a later point and use again. So what are some things you have to think about if you're going to go on this podcast journey? Obviously, your podcast needs a name. Again, that's where we kind of had a little head start with Inside the FBI. We talked about it a lot. We all still really liked the name, so we stuck with it. We did rebrand the logo and kind of the purpose of the show, but we kind of liked the behind-the-scenes feel of the show title. What will we talk about? This was another big thing that we discussed at length. Depending on your agency and your goals, it may be very well that you really want to focus on one key thing or one key program. And that's great. You know best what your audience needs and is looking for. For us, the FBI has a wide range of investigative priorities, and we cover that in our stories and on our website elsewhere. So for us, it only felt right to do that in the podcast as well, to not leave any topic off the table and to be open to any sort of idea or story that we would have the opportunity to tell. And then you might have to think a little bit about what your podcast format is going to be. So I'll get more into this later, but we sort of saw two different styles of podcasts. And if you listen to podcasts, this might make a little more sense, so bear with me a second. We sort of saw, there's a version where it's kind of like a sit-down interview with a host and an expert, and that interview just kind of gets recorded and repurposed as a podcast kind of as is. So we called that the interview style. There was also sort of this more narrative or storytelling style that we saw out there from other shows that we loved, where you could tell that an interview happened and then people pulled sound bites from that interview and took the sound bites and wrote a script and a narration around those sound bites. So it's not just a recording of an interview that gets, music and all that sort of good stuff. It's more of a story that's been written based on an interview. So we predominantly do the narrative and storytelling style podcast, and I'll get more into the benefits of that and why we chose that. But we've done some interview ones as well. We've also done episodes that have no interviews. I've written a couple just on the fly and narrated them myself. So it's just me talking about something. Our most recent episode is like that. So that's an option as well, depending on the needs that you have, the needs your audience has, and what your goals are. Other big things you'll really have to consider when producing a podcast is that it is intense when it comes to technology, equipment, and software, and that means budget is going to play a role. I understand that depending on your agency and your office, your budget may be zero. And that may be a challenge that you'll have to find ways to overcome or convince someone to give you money to help you with this podcast. There are a lot of free resources out there. I actually don't remember any by name. I think there used to be a mixing tool called GarageBand that may or may not still be out there, may or may not still be free. But if you are kind of looking for free or inexpensive tools out there, they do exist. Another thing you have to think about is your staff. I know some people have budgets of 0 and offices of 1, and that may be another challenge that you have to face. In our office, I'm sort of the program manager of the podcast. I have kind of like a technical producer editor who helps out with that side of the house. And then I work on writing and interviewing for shows, and then some of our writers who are on our staff as well, who are interested in producing podcast episodes, they also pitch in with the writing and editing. So I'm fortunate to have a couple other people help out. You'll also have to consider what platforms you want to be on, where do you want to host your show. In addition to things like Apple and Spotify and Google and whatnot, there are third-party services that you can host your show with, and those, they're often paid services, but they will kind of feed your show out there to several platforms. So those are options as well when you're looking at how to get your show hosted. And also, as always, think about management expectations. For us, like I mentioned, this was something that we sort of saw an opportunity to grab and do, and we sort of volunteered to do it. And management's expectations were, that's great, but you still have to do everything else you were doing before. So I was like, okay. And management expectations may shift. Now that we've had a podcast for 2 years, everybody's really excited about it and loves that we have a podcast and thinks we should do it all the time. So just make sure there's a good understanding with what management expects from you and from the show. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and just talk about the kind of tools and equipment and software and stuff you may want to consider if you're going to dive in here. I like to remind you to think about what you already have that might help you out here. So meeting platforms. The one that rhymes with beans is one that we're approved to use. And we have actually conducted a ton of interviews and recorded interviews using meeting platforms. It saves the audio file and we're able to use that. This helps us a lot because at the FBI, a lot of people that I talk to are across the country. I can't just fly out to interview somebody for an hour and fly home. So being able to use a meeting platform that saves the audio file and actually is pretty good quality was a game changer for us when that came along. Someone also told me that some meeting platforms will also now transcribe your meetings. Our version of some meeting platforms is a little behind, so that may have been a feature that was out there for a while, but we just got it, so it's breaking news for us. Your mobile phone, maybe that's all you have to record, and a lot of phones have an app to do that. Handheld recorders is going to be something, if you do have a little bit of a budget, that you may want to look at. You know, that you literally just hold like this. You've probably seen them before. People stick them in your face. During, the first year of the pandemic, I did all my narrations into a handheld recorder. I don't have a picture, but it was very much the in your closet with a blanket over your head, trying to make it as quiet and soundproof as possible while your HVAC is going off and your dog is barking. It's really hard to edit out those kinds of things in the process. The handheld recorders are a perfectly reasonable thing to use for both interviews and for narration. And finally, kind of the next level on the budget tier would be microphones and mixers. As we started returning to the office and we kind of had proof of concept with this show, we were able to procure some more, traditional podcast equipment like microphones and mixers. So again, you have a lot of different options for recording audio. In terms of producing and mixing, think about if you'll need a transcription service, since we pull sound bites and also post full transcripts of all our episodes. We do have everything transcribed. You need to look at the mixing software. Again, budget there kind of is all over the place. You'll have to consider if you want to use music and or sound services. I would say of anything, music is probably the most optional. If you think of the shows that you listen to regularly, a lot of them probably don't use music, perhaps with the exception of a theme song. So I think a podcast can be produced just fine without music, but it is something that we happen to use. Training. Do you and your fellow colleagues or whoever is going to be involved here need any sort of training? Again, the internet has lots of free training. There's also paid training that you can invest in. I was fortunate enough to be able to get kind of like a Podcast 101 course that kind of taught me a little bit about each piece. And that was really helpful, especially with kind of dipping my toes into the professional side. Just think about what training you want or may need, and then finally the hosting services and platforms, especially if you're going to look into kind of like the third-party middleman platforms that feed out your podcast elsewhere. And again, because I'm the FBI, here's your disclaimer. If you're looking at any sort of equipment, software, etc., whether it's free or paid, always do your research, review the terms of service depending on if you're local, state, federal, there may be different things you can or can't sign on to, and know your agency's policies. So I have to put that in there. I know, I feel like it's so dark. So episode production, what does the process look like? Once we kind of identified all the things that I had just talked about, we sat down and really wanted to map out what it was going to look like to produce an episode. That way it was something that we could repeat whether I was in the office or not. It was something that we hoped would lend consistency to each episode, but it's also something that we've refined over time as we've done this more and more. So we kind of started with a paper map that you used to get at the gas station. Then we kind of refined it and we got our GPS that you put at the front. And now I feel like we've got a process that's like the app on your phone. Like we kind of know where we're going, we know what we're doing, and we kind of trust in the process now. Not every episode follows the same process, and I know this is hard to see, the screen's a little small, but generally speaking, this is kind of the flow of show. There's kind of 4 phases, and I'll get into each one a little bit deeper. But each show kind of goes from story to script here at the top. There's a second line phase for us, which is a review process. Again, depending on you and your show, a review process may be you sending it to like your colleague or your boss. The review process is going to look a lot different for each agency or office. For us, we always have somebody else review it. I review every episode, and any subject matter experts who are involved or interviewed also review the script. There's a production phase that ends up hopefully with a nice, pretty MP3 at the end, and there's a publishing phase that includes like getting the word out and going back and looking at your data. So I'm going to kind of break down the process. So where do we get our story ideas? Like I said, we are open to like any and all sorts of stories on our show. So one day you may hear about a top 10 fugitive, and the next you may be hearing about cybercrime. Sometimes our ideas come from the Good Idea Fairy. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with her. She's love her and hate her. But a lot of our story ideas come from public interest. We look at the data about what people are interested in on our website and our social media, and we're able to kind of say, okay, they would probably be interested in a podcast about that too if they're looking about it on our site. Personal and professional interests. There have been topics that I'm just like, I want to do a podcast on that, and I've sought that out. We get requests from individuals outside public affairs who want their program or team or case highlighted on the show, and we'll field those requests as much as possible. Events and anniversaries we'll highlight. And just, hey, like I mentioned before, we have a story and we have good audio from that interview, let's make that into a podcast. Or maybe we have a larger campaign of something we're trying to push out, and a podcast is kind of a piece of that puzzle. So here's some examples of some episodes we've done. Again, sorry it's a little blurry. But this top one here was an episode about holiday scams. Every year in November, it comes to us, okay, it's going to be holiday scams time again. People are really interested, but we've talked about it for like decades now, and the information doesn't change too much anymore. It's kind of how to stay safe when you're shopping online, what to do if you get defrauded, that sort of thing. But in 2020, it was the first year we had our podcast, and when it came around to holiday scams time, it's like, oh, we've never told our holiday scams message in a podcast before. So that was an opportunity for us to tell an old story in a new way and potentially reach a new audience who maybe didn't get that message from us before. We have one over here about one of our top 10 fugitives. If you're familiar with the FBI's like 10 Most Wanted, we do episodes on them now because that's what we know from our web and social media that people are really interested in. And these are some of the highest performing episodes. We did an episode on healthcare fraud, which I was initially skeptical about. It was a request that we got as part of a larger campaign. And they actually had a really compelling case for us to share, and they really humanized what it's like to be a victim of healthcare fraud and how that could affect you personally. So it ended up being one of the better episodes we did, I thought. We did one on Oak Bomb for the 25th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. That was something else that we had covered extensively for previous anniversaries. And again, now we had a podcast and we had an opportunity to get a first-hand account from the agent who was on the scene. Let's share that in podcast form. And finally, we did an episode on UFOs around Halloween last year because I personally was super interested in the FBI's history with UFOs. So that was one that I sought out and decided to do pretty much for personal and professional interest. And these all look a little different so that you can kind of see what it looks like across different platforms. Like this one with the picture is actually the version that's on our website. So we put all of them on our website. It's probably the last place people look for your podcast, but we like to put them there too. I think we're required to too.
When you said that the healthcare fraud was a request, was that an internal request?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Not a listener request. But
No, nobody. My listeners don't. That would be nice. Hey. Yes, it was a request from our healthcare fraud team. There was a push, I think it was like last fall, to start talking more about healthcare fraud, and that was one of the elements of the campaign that we decided to do for them. Again, kind of telling the story we may have told before in a new way, and trying something new to help them out. Okay, so when you're thinking of stories, what story do you want to tell and why? How is this going to benefit your audience? Think about what style you're going to do it. Are you going to interview someone and just push out the interview? Valid option, totally fine. Are you going to make it more of like a narrative style? Or are you just going to sit down and write a script and relay this information? Figure out who you need to interview, if anybody, and what's the call to action or take-home message for your listeners? Since we're the government, we're kind of providing a service to the people, and I like our podcast to do that as well. So at the end of every episode, we kind of like to wrap up, if you see this top tenor, here's how to send us a tip. Like, if you walk away with nothing else about the top tenor episode, know how to contact us if you come in contact with this guy. Or healthcare fraud. If you've been a victim, here's what that looks like and here's what to do. So when people come to me and they say they want to do a podcast or they want us to do a podcast, one of the first things I always ask is, what is your call to action or your take-home message for the audience? Like, what are they going to get out of listening to this episode? So, quick interlude on interviews. If you do choose to do episodes with interviews, whether it's just sit down or the narrative style, first of all, don't panic if you've never done an interview before. Before I started this show, I had never done an interview and I panicked, so don't be like me. I actually made a coworker call onto the interview as an emotional support coworker, and she just muted herself and sat in the background, but having her there got me through it. Interview friends and colleagues to get practice. Prepare for the interview, obviously. Prep your questions in advance. But in the course of the interview, don't feel afraid to ask any follow-up questions if someone says something that needs clarification, or they started on a good track and you want to kind of pull out more from there. If you're interviewing someone, you want to get them to say certain things, especially if you're pulling sound bites. So never be afraid to ask anything that you think is a stupid or basic question. Because sometimes what I really need is for someone to say something as simple as, a UFO is an unidentified flying object. I want that person to say that. So sometimes you feel a little silly asking things. But one, it's for sound bites sometimes. And two, this may be your audience's first exposure to a specific topic. So you may want to make sure that they're getting their basic questions answered, as well. One thing I do like about the narrative style podcast when I do interviews is it seems to make the guests a little more comfortable, because I tell them, you can stop and start again. You can rephrase what you just said. Like, I'm not going to record this and put this out there as it is. They seem to relax a little more when they know they don't have to be perfect, or don't feel that they have to be perfect in every take. Interview in a quiet place. Again, that's key. It helps you out a lot when you get to the technical phase, not having to edit out any noise. And again, weird stuff like creaky floors, HVACs, all that stuff can kind of interfere with your sound. And remember, an interview is just a conversation. Relax, you're talking to someone who hopefully knows what they're talking about, and they should be excited to be talking to you. Okay, so you've got your interview done. We get our interviews transcribed. And this is the stage for us where we're going to kind of comb through that transcript of the interview and pull out the sound bites that we like. And then we take those sound bites and we write a bigger script all around it. It is a bigger lift than maybe just writing a script and narrating it as just you, or recording an interview and pushing out just that interview. This is the longer process, but I do believe it has some benefits and that it has served us well in the process of doing our show. Like I said, it makes the most of the interviewees more comfortable to know they have some flexibility and they can relax a little bit during the interview. Something else I love about doing it this way is that I can do multiple interviews at different times and kind of easily combine them if I want multiple subject matter experts to participate. And I can rearrange sound bites really easily, and I don't really have to worry about interrupting the flow of anything. Something else that I really found I like about this way of doing things is that it gives the narrator an opportunity to summarize or re-emphasize or clarify a subject matter expert's point. So maybe it takes my subject matter expert 10 sentences to explain something, and it's not to begrudge them, but maybe I could, as the narrator, take that, sum it up in 2 sentences, and we could kind of move on a little faster. So I like being able to do that as the narrator as well. And a quick mention here on outlines, because I know sometimes when people hear writing, the first thing they might think about is like, Monica, did you write an outline? Outlines I feel are really personal choices. Some people love outlines and outline like everything they do. And some people, like me, just have like terrible flashbacks to high school. So I see outlining as a personal choice. When and how you do it may vary by person, it may vary by episode. If you do want to do an outline, it's never a bad thing. I just recommend that if you're gonna do an interview and do that narrative style, to outline after the interview, because I think it helps you a lot more in organizing your show. And I'll show you an example. So this is a very basic outline for an episode that I did. And you know, again, it's kind of blurry, I'm sorry. But you can see that my outline is basically, part 1, part 2, and I've kind of named the parts. And that's how I would organize as I go along. I was just reviewing the interview and knowing the story I want to tell. I know kind of the flow of show. Okay, I want to talk about the case basics first. This is for a missing children's case. What are the basic information? Who is this little girl that went missing? Let's transition to that. And I organize everything kind of by how I've broken it up throughout the outline. So when I go back to the interview, I start pulling the sound bites into where they belong in the outline. I don't really worry too much at this point about organizing everything perfectly or writing around it, but just what are the sound bites I like and where are they gonna fit in this episode? And this is also an example where you can see in part 1, I pulled out a clip of an interview that's 7 minutes into the interview. So I think the first thing any subject matter expert says was 7 minutes into when I was talking to him. But in part 2, later in the episode, I pulled a clip that was 2 minutes in. So that's an example where you can see where I kind of rearranged the interview to fit how I wanted to tell the story in the end. Something else I really want to emphasize about writing a podcast script is that it's not the same as writing a story. It's not the same as writing a press release. You're writing for the ear. Your medium at the end of the day is a podcast. And that's how most people are hopefully going to consume it. You will have people who just want to read your transcription or may need to read your transcription, and that's fine. But we're working with an audio medium, and you want to I call it writing for the ear. And ways to kind of learn to improve your podcast scripting is, first and foremost, listen to other podcasts. Like I said, I've been listening to podcasts for like 10 years at that point, to a wide variety of shows, and I felt like I kind of had a good grasp on how a podcast script sounded. So more than anything, I think my podcast listenership throughout the years was what gave me the biggest advantage when it came time to writing my own episodes. When you write your script and you feel like you're happy with it, read it to yourself out loud. They actually recommend you do this for anything that you write to be read as well. It's a really good way to make sure that you're clear, that everything kind of sounds good. But it really helps you catch things that you might trip over or that might sound funny, or that maybe if you're reading them, it works, but if you have to say them, it doesn't quite. Would you say it in that way in a conversation? If not, there may be a better way to say it for the podcast. I also advise you not to get hung up on things like grammar. This is really hard for me personally. Grammar, AP style, all that sort of stuff. Again, we're kind of leaning more into a script that's more conversational as opposed to following AP style or whatever style you use to a T. And as with writing, plain language prevails. So that's another place where sometimes it helps as the narrator to kind of take what an interviewee may have said and kind of, say the same thing but in a plain language way that's kind of easier to hear. In addition to reading your script yourself, always get someone else to read it. People find stuff all the time that they can improve upon on my scripts. Some people catch things for accuracy. So always get someone to read your script. Hopefully you have a friendly in your office that can help you out with that. So this is, again, really blurry, sorry, but this is what a finished script ends up looking like. This is the same missing children's case that you saw the outline for. So this is what the finished product ended up looking like. In this particular episode, I had 3 subject matter experts that I interviewed, and they chime in at various points throughout the show. So again, I was able to pop in as the narrator, and then Detective Adams comes in, And then the narrator comes in, and at this stage, this part here was all something that the next speaker said, but I took the opportunity as the narrator to kind of summarize a program that he was going to talk about, and also use it as a case to transition, and also kind of give you a break between the two male voices that sounded a little similar. So again, I really tried to leverage my role as the narrator to kind of help the listener along. And so I kind of talk about a program like in general terms, and then I kick it off to the next speaker who talks about it more specific to that particular case. But this is how a finished script ends up looking for a piece of it. So you've got your script, and then you hate your voice, but you have to narrate. I hate my voice too, so you have to get over it if you're going to narrate, or you find somebody else in your office who is willing to narrate. I'm fortunate that I do have a couple people in my office who love to narrate as well, so we kind of take turns. That was another decision we made, is that since this was kind of a passion project for a number of us, you know, from an audience perspective, it may feel more friendly to have, you know, one person every single episode. In terms of staff resources, you know, people being out of town when I need a narration, and just people's like desire to participate in the podcast program, we decided to just, you know, kind of make it a free-for-all with narration. But you do have to get over it if you want to narrate. Some tips for narration: again, record in a quiet place. I can't say it enough. Remember that your narration is kind of your chance to have a conversation with your audience. So going back to kind of like that plain language idea, the idea that this is a friendly conversation, you're speaking to an audience, how would you talk to a friend? Listen again to other podcasts, what voices do you like or not like? One piece of advice I'll give is don't imitate other voices. I made that mistake in the beginning. I found a voice out there that sounded similar to mine, and I sort of thought, okay, like this is how my podcast voice should be. But you kind of just get stuck on that. Like, you know, do I sound enough like this other person? Am I doing my podcast voice right? Settle in, relax. Like, you have to practice. That's the only thing that will make you better, quite honestly. But be yourself. Don't try to be somebody else. You have to listen to yourself, and you have to get other people to listen to you as well. You're going to release this to the masses, so there's going to be a ton of people that are eventually going to hear your voice. Is there anyone in your office that can listen to you first and give you constructive feedback? My current technical producer, she's been with us a little over a year now. She has the nicest way of giving constructive feedback about my narrations. Essentially, each episode she's like, this is better than the last one. You're not as monotone. I'm like, okay, I'm getting better. Like, okay, you know. And then the next episode, she's like, we almost sounded friendly in this episode. Like, way to go. So take the constructive feedback, appreciate it, and use it as best you can. It's helped me a lot. It's helped me relax a little more and kind of get into that more conversational, friendly podcast host as opposed to like stilted, you know, monotone. And again, if you get tripped up on anything while you're narrating, rephrase it on the fly. Don't get hung up on, I wrote it this way, it has to be this way. If you can't say it, like forensic is a really hard word to say over and over again, but I have to say forensic a lot sometimes. But if you can change it and you can say it the new way, say it the different way. I always record my narration twice, and I listen to both. You'd be surprised how entirely different you might sound saying the same thing 2 different times. So there may be things that I like from one versus two. So I like to record myself twice and kind of hear the difference, hear what I like. And again, practice makes you better. It may not make you perfect, but I would say practice is the only way to get better at narrating. So in terms of mixing and music, that's kind of the next step. You've got a script, you've got all your sound bites, you've got your narration file. Now you're ready to get it put all together. This is the most technically demanding part of putting together a show. So depending, again, on your resources, on your staff, on your budget, this may influence a lot of how you do your show. Maybe you end up doing a show where it's just you as a narrator reading a script because you can avoid a lot of the mixing process. Or maybe you're able to get the training and the software you need that will allow you to put together different clips and added music and all that good stuff. So like I said, I kind of have a technical editor now, so I don't do this part myself, full disclosure, but she did send some general tips in case anyone is interested on the things that she looks for. I know I've said it 100 times, but she wanted to reiterate that recording in quiet spaces will save you in the long run. Whatever software you end up using, know it and know it well. Every software has different features and different quirks. So even if you're an expert in this one, if you switch to this one, it's a whole new ballgame. Levels are your friend. Levels is basically like when you hear something really quiet, and then all of a sudden it gets really loud, and the volume is kind of all over the place. You want to make sure that an episode has like a consistent volume level throughout. And if you get into a tool, it allows you to kind of adjust those levels and even everything out. Something else I thought that she pointed out that I wouldn't have thought of is, you have consistency in an episode, but make sure you have consistent volume levels in all your episodes. So when someone finds an episode and they decide to binge your whole show, they won't have to turn the volume down between episode 1 and 2, and then back up between 2 and 3. So be consistent with your levels. Just like with the script, listen to an episode, have other people listen to an episode. I am really picky about certain things that other people aren't, and other people are picky about certain things that I may not necessarily catch. So it's always good to have as many people as you can take a listen and kind of hear those little transitions or a level being funky. And I think this was a word of caution on her end. Don't trust your export. Listen to everything one last time, even when you think you've got a final file. I think I've heard a number of expletives from her before when something has corrupted. You can always tell when she's working on one of my podcasts in the office. So always listen to everything one last time. Music, like I mentioned before, I think music is optional, but it can be something that kind of enhances your show. If you do decide to use music, just make sure it's appropriate. Like, we wouldn't use anything uplifting and cutesy for one of our top 10 episodes. So make sure the tone of your show and the tone of your music match up. And you might find a song that you like, but it doesn't necessarily fit. Listen to the whole track. There may be elements of that track that you can pull into your episode, and instead of using the whole song, you can just use pieces of it and have it come in or out. Again, your primary content, your show, your voice, your interviewee, that's what needs to shine here. The music is just kind of in the background to enhance everything. Again, with levels, you can adjust music levels. So maybe when you listen to a track, it sounds really loud, but you add it into the show, you can bring the levels down, have it enhance your show that way. And again, with your friendly disclaimer, just make sure you're licensing all music and sound effects and whatnot appropriately. So I got through this whole presentation and realized I did a whole slide deck on podcasts, but didn't actually give anyone a podcast to listen to, which felt like a strange omission. I felt like you should kind of get the opportunity to hear a bit of a finished product. So I mean, I hope this works, but this is the introduction to our UFO episode. And as you can see, if you look at our show, all of our shows kind of have like a brief introduction or like hook, I guess you would say. And then we always do, on this episode, here's what to expect. So if people really want to bail, they know what they're getting into and they know they can, stop listening, or maybe we've hooked them in when we told them what we're going to get into. And then the host always introduces himself. So this is, we'll see if it works. And how loud it is. Hold on. I think it's only coming out on my laptop. Yeah. I won't dwell on this too long. Come back. You get the vibe.
Since 1947, concerned citizens have been alerting the FBI to a variety of strange objects they've spotted in the sky. Flying discs, saucers, flapjacks. On this episode of Inside the FBI, we sat down with the FBI's historian to uncover the truth about some of our noteworthy cases involving unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. I'm Monica Grover, and this is Inside the FBI.
Catch a little theme song. You kind of get the idea of how an episode starts out for us and how you can use music and sound effects to kind of set the mood a little more. So that was an episode that, myself and the historian and my technical editor really had the opportunity to have a little fun with. So you've got this episode, you pushed it out on whatever platforms you're using. That's not the end. You have to let people know that it's out there. There are going to be the people who stumble upon it through their podcast platform. Maybe they listen to something and Spotify is like, hey, you might like this as well. That definitely happens, but what we have learned through our data is that telling people that it's out there really makes a difference in listenership. So what do we tell people and how? We use our social media channels, obviously, to push stuff out. So this is Twitter. Starting about a year or so ago, we started branding all our podcast posts all the same, and it's a different graphic than anything else we do. So when we push out a podcast on social media, it always looks like it's a podcast episode, and nothing else looks like a podcast episode. This middle one is an Instagram story. We had never done Instagram stories prior to the podcast. So it was kind of cool that not only had we launched this new podcast, but it was also opening other doors to other things that we could kind of try. So we saw Instagram stories as kind of we saw the podcast as an opportunity to kind of try out Instagram stories in kind of an easy, low-risk way. And finally, the last one there is an old school email alert. I think that's an audience we tend to forget about. But we have thousands of people that subscribe to our various email alerts, and that's an audience that we wanted to alert to podcasts as well. So the next few slides, I'm going to get into showing you some of the data, real data from some of our episodes. I know it's a little blurry, so I'll try my best to help you out. This is from a third-party host that we use to push it out. So this data is predominantly Spotify listeners, which doesn't tell the whole story, but kind of gives you an idea of some of the feedback that we get. This blue spike here is an episode that we did in 2021, so last year, to mark Missing Children's Day. It's a national day, and we did an episode about it. A year later, we did this episode on Missing Children's Day. So you can see, these are probably the episodes that are easiest to compare. Exact same topic, very similar release dates. You can see like the huge difference in episode listenership. So that to us showed, okay, whatever we have done in the past year, something is working, we're earning listeners. So yeah, go back to old episodes and see like, have I been earning listeners? Are people listening? Something else we can see too is that when people kind of find a new episode, they tend to go back and kind of pick and choose what old episodes they want to listen to as well. So that kind of clues us in like, okay, we're doing something okay here. This here kind of demonstrates what I was talking about when I mentioned like the importance of letting people know about an episode. For some reason, we were a little late on Valentine's Day, but we did an episode on romance scams, and this is the old branding we used to use. But on February 16th, we released our romance scams episode. And you can see we got a little blip here and a little blip here. But on day 3, there's a huge spike in listenership. And that huge spike in listenership corresponds directly with the day we sent out the tweet on that episode. And this happens a lot across our episodes, where there's a clear connection between the social media promotion and the listenership that we got. So this kind of data is important for us to know, like, okay, what we're doing on social is important, and we need to keep that up. And it's so important that we made an effort to kind of improve, like I said, our branding on social when it came to the podcast. This next one here, this is data that our team compiled. But this one I just think is fascinating because the purple is Apple, the blue is predominantly Spotify and other platforms, but the green is actually YouTube. And these are listens per quarter. Someone came to me at some point and was like, we should put our podcast on YouTube. And I was like, okay, like there's no harm in that, but like what's that gonna do? And I was totally proven wrong because in some cases, YouTube completely blows the actual podcast platforms out of the water. So this is a lesson in trying something new, and sometimes people's crazy ideas are really good ideas. It still blows my mind. And this last piece of data here is on kind of like the public interest side of the house. The top episode from April to June, I guess Q3 of the fiscal year, across YouTube and our podcast platforms, was all the top 10 episodes. So this data reinforces, that is the content that people are coming here for. It reinforces to us that we were correct in starting to do these, and we should continue to do these, because clearly this is what people are coming to listen to, if it's the most listened to episode in that small time frame across all platforms. So we're making an effort to cover future additions to the top 10 program on our show. So, we've got this process, we've got this show, we haven't perfected it, there's still a lot we can do, but we've got our own challenges, and one of them, like I mentioned at the outset, is that we have a lot of competing duties in our office. Nobody gets to do this 100% of the time. There's no one person who's just the podcast person. I have a whole bunch of other stuff going on at the same time I'm trying to run this show. So it doesn't always go exactly as planned or, my pie in the sky dreams. Kind of feeding into that, the biggest thing I think we would wish to do if we were able was to set a release schedule, a consistent release schedule. If you guys are big fans of any show out there, okay, my favorite show drops on Friday. That's when the new episode comes out. And that's one of the things that gets people to come back, is that expectation that there's going to be a new episode on that certain day of the week, or even the first Tuesday of every month, or every other Wednesday. So if there was one thing I think we all wish that we had the staffing and the resources and the time to do, it would be kind of to build that backlog, or to get on the schedule where we'd be able to release consistently and give audience kind of that dependable schedule. And finally, I showed you a lot of what listener data tells you, or listenership data tells you, but it doesn't tell you everything that you may want to know. It's not a huge challenge, but sometimes you want to really know everything, and the data may not offer you everything you want to know. So some final pieces of wisdom. Like you can tell, there are a lot of moving pieces, parts, and skill sets that you may need to put on a podcast. I know it may be a challenge in terms of budget and resources, and that's not meant to scare you. It's just kind of to be realistic with you, or for you to be realistic with whoever is begging you to start a podcast. It takes time and effort to produce even a 10-minute episode. I'm still amazed at how much goes into putting together an episode. And then everyone is excited, for better or worse, that you have a podcast, and you may get a lot of people who think they know what you should talk about, or they want to be on your show. So be prepared once you're out there that, internally people are like, hey, here you have a podcast, like, can I be on it? Some tips I have from my own trials and tribulations. Stay organized by episode. Kind of like with outlines, I've sort of have grown into appreciating organization. So I stay organized by episode one now. My sound bites, my notes, my script, etc. Everything's in a folder specific to that episode. I once lost an entire interview file, and it was mad panic. But oddly enough, I had sent it to a coworker, just the interview, and she had it. So she was my backup. But that's all that to say is to find some way to back up your files, whether that's in OneDrive, or sending it to yourself in an email, or sending it to a coworker, or maybe you have one of those backup disk things. Find a way to back your stuff up. You never want to tell someone, hey, that hour we spent on the phone, we got to do it again. They probably won't be very excited about that. Don't be afraid to refine or change your process as you go. Make your podcast accessible. Like I mentioned, we get everything transcribed. As the federal government, we're required under Section 508 to make sure that everything is accessible for whoever wants it or needs it that way. But whether you have to abide by accessibility rules or not, I think it's really important to post the transcript because not everybody may be able to or may want to listen to something, even though that's kind of the medium we're working in, but they would be happy to read it. And they're still getting the content, and at the end of the day, that's what we want. And like I demonstrated with all of these stats and the social media, get the word out. You can put a podcast out there into the void, but make sure people know that you're out there talking. So as kind of my take-home message for you all, podcasting is so much fun. I really love that I've been able to do this as someone, again, who's a huge fan of podcasts. The fact that I get to have a hand in producing one is like, I never would have dreamed of that. And it's really given us a new way to communicate, even old stories, kind of brought to life again through this new medium. But it is hard, not to scare you, just to prepare you. So be reasonable with yourself, be kind with yourself, be reasonable with your team and your management about expectations about what's going to be accomplished through this podcast. And enjoy it, have fun. It really is the thing that I'm most excited about at work. So here's my sign off. I am Monica Grover from the FBI's Office of Public Affairs. Thanks for tuning in. So I have time for questions if anybody has any. Yes?
I was wondering if you are working on episodes, like multiple episodes at a time, or are you totally focused on one? How do you do that?
Sure, that's a great question. So since I do have a couple people on my team who are interested in the podcast program, we pretty much have a bunch going at once. So if you have an idea or you've done an interview, I kind of, you're like team captain of that episode. And so we've got, team captain, like I did one recently, so that was my episode and I kind of saw it through the process. But at the same time, I had somebody working on one on a totally different topic, but that was hers to kind of shepherd through the process, to get the interview, to write the script. She may hand it off to someone else to narrate, But yeah, we kind of have a bunch going at once, which you would think would mean we could release them on a consistent schedule. But again, competing priorities often get in the way. And again, it's because I have a number of people who can help out that we're able to do that. If it's just one person, I think you could handle more than one at once. Like I've juggled more than one at once myself. But for me, the best way to kind of see one through is to just sit down with one and just bang it out and not worry about the other ones at the time. So, yeah.
So on average, how often are you able to get an episode out? I know you said it's not consistent,
yeah.
But like once a month maybe, or?
I would say on average it ends up being once a month. Our goal is twice a month. We took an unintentional summer hiatus. But we're back as of the end of August, I think it was. And yeah, our goal is 2 episodes a month. But it may be like September 1st and then September 30th that ends up being. So again, you don't necessarily get that like consistent day of the week or consistent gap between episodes. But yeah, we shoot for 2. Yeah.
What would you say is the turnaround time for editing these episodes? I know you said there's a lot goes into it. But with your podcast, have you guys fallen into like a time frame, a consistency of some sort?
From the technical side of the house?
Yeah, just editing wise, and putting it all together, and then the final reviews to approve it, to actually post it and put it out.
Yeah, I'd say from start to finish, usually takes about a month.
Okay.
The interview is the fastest part. Script writing can take a while. That usually takes me about a week if I really have nothing else going on. And technical editing usually takes a couple days. And technical editing is a lot of back and forth, at least in our case, because I do have someone else who's doing it. So she'll kind of put it all together and send it my way and say, hey, what do you think of this? And then I have all the feedback. She knows my music preferences now, but at the start we had to work out, kind of what's the music going to be. I send it back, she makes the changes, it comes back. So the technical side, again, depending on how you have it set up, for us it has a lot of back and forth, and that usually ends up taking, a couple days to a week as well. But when we're ready to push it out, if we have a final file, like that part's super fast. But I tend to tell people that I interview, after this interview, budget kind of a month before the episode would be completed. So.
Oh, thank you.
Did that answer everything?
It did, yes.
Okay,
Thank
alright,
you.
so I think I missed a part.
No, you're
So,
fine.
you had a question, yes.
So first, if anyone's looking for editing software, Audacity, it's free, open source, really easy to use, so just want to point that out.
Good one, thank you.
The question I had is about the meeting platform.
Sure.
So to make sure I understand how this works, I'm guessing you're on a computer with a microphone connected to the computer and you connect that way?
Yes, so I'll get on, it's Teams, it's Microsoft Teams. I get on Teams and I've got my headphones with actually just a headphone mic. And usually the person on the other end does the same. And it's like having a conference call. Like you and I, like I'd invite you to a call, you log on. I stress to them again, like make sure it's quiet where you are. And I mute myself, when they're speaking. But yeah, I just record the meeting. And it's not the same quality as if they were with me in the podcast studio on a real microphone. But again, if I have to talk to somebody in Sacramento, like I've been pleasantly surprised by the quality of the audio that I've gotten from their interviews. So.
Okay. So do they also have to connect with a computer and headphones and microphone, or can they actually call into this meeting platform too?
Yeah, so on Teams they can call in through a dial-in number and partake. Something else that we have done that worked well, kind of more in the beginning of the pandemic when we didn't have a lot of equipment is, it's kind of an involved process, but what we would do is we would set up a conference call line and I would call in and the speaker would call in to the conference call line, and I'd also have another phone that was like my recording phone, and I actually had that handheld recorder that I talked about plugged into the recording phone, recording the conference call. It's a lot, I know, but that was kind of a way that we could get around this before the meeting platform let us record, is basically recording a conference call onto the handheld recorder. So that's another option if you have that equipment available to you. And again, for the most part, the audio turned out really well. So, and I think too, like, I see your hand. I think too, there's like inherent forgiveness almost for podcast listeners. Like they know if you're gonna call somebody on the phone that it's not gonna sound perfect, like you're in the studio. Like if you've listened to shows before, you can tell when they had to call somebody on the phone, but that's what they had to do to make the episode possible. So I think there's kind of that understanding that like this is the world we're working in, and it sounds like a phone call. Okay, move on. So okay, yes.
One thing related to that, there's an app called Soundflower,
Okay.
which lets you separate those channels of audio coming in. So if you're trying to record a meeting, you can have more control, which is nice.
Nice.
There's like a free version, but also a paid version.
Okay, Soundflower?
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
But I did have a question.
Yes.
So we have a really strong-willed good idea, Barry.
Yes.
Is
I'm
it-
familiar. Is it the same one?
And they are so we do an interview-based podcast.
Yep.
And it's our town manager. And so, my question is, how do you like to use, or your analytics or anything to sort of really justify what your episode topics are? Because we have wildly fluctuating success with episodes.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're just kind of shooting in the dark about what we should do, even though we have the data for what to cover.
Yeah, I agree. That's tricky. On the one, a lot of people, quite frankly, are trying to put it in a polite way, are not necessarily amenable to looking at the data. So I think that's one challenge that isn't always impossible to overcome, but is difficult to overcome. I think, I don't think I'm gonna be able to answer your question in a great way. I think for us, we're still at that point where we're also shooting in the dark, but that's kind of part of where we are right now in our process is let's keep figuring out what works. So yeah, I apologize. I guess I don't really have a good answer
No
for
worries.
you, but I would just commiserate more than anything. I think we're kind of dealing with similar things. But the best you can do, we've put together, reports and strategies and stuff to show we tried this and it didn't work. I think one good thing that you can do if you're saying this didn't work as a podcast, a lot of times we'll turn around and say, okay, this topic didn't work as a podcast, let's not do that again, or let's stay away from podcast topics like that. But here are other things we could try instead. So we kind of have this no but philosophy. Like, no, we're not going to do a podcast on this, but here's a different menu that you can select from to try to do something else, and let's see if that works. Maybe we can go back to a podcast later, but I'm trying not to, offer that. So it's not a perfect answer, but I think,
It's helpful, thank you.
we're struggling in similar ways. So, yes.
So I have a variety of questions, but the biggest thing I think a lot of people here probably are wondering is we all work in government, and so what that approval process looks like. So it's done and it's been sitting in the hopper for God knows how long, and now you're trying to get it out the door. What does that process look like? And then also, when it comes to the budget, how much money do you think you had invested prior to you guys like essentially launching and coming in clutch to where you are now?
Sure. So, in terms of budget, this is another place where I really apologize that I can't give you a good answer. You can hit me up and we can follow up afterwards.
Sure.
I don't handle that side of the house, so I would have no real way of giving you anything that'd be useful, and I apologize for that. But if anyone wants to hit me up about anything, even if it's budget, feel free, and I will get you what you're looking for. And in terms of approval, I do think that our office is pretty fortunate that we've been kind of doing this in other forms for quite some time in terms of stories and videos. This is another instance where every episode is a little different, but I approve every single episode as kind of the program manager, so a lot of it falls on me. If it's my episode that I've been like the team captain of, I make sure that our web editor, kind of like our lead person, is the final approver. Our direct boss is kind of like, you guys know what you're doing. So we are trusted to seek out the approvals that we think are necessary. We have at the FBI our national press office. They're the unit that deals like directly with the media and whatnot. They're always given the script before it goes out and a heads up before it goes out. In the case of something like, I think the UFO one generated a couple calls from them kind of thing, so that they know what we're going to put out there on the podcast, and that they might want to be on alert that they might get questions about it. Subject matter experts, so whoever I interviewed for that episode gets to see the script before I do any of the recording. In case they have any accuracy changes or they don't want something in there for whatever reason, they have a chance to flag anything major. I don't want them rewriting my script, like they're looking for the big things that might be incorrect, or they've realized, oh, whoops, we can't say that after all. Sometimes those subject matter experts want to elevate it to their management, which again, we say, that's fine, it's going to delay things a little bit, but, and again, only looking for red flags here, so we let them do that as well. So really, a lot of it is just kind of the trust that we've earned over the years in doing other content to kind of be able to push this out. But nothing goes out without at least another pair or two of eyes, so. Anything else? I know it's lunchtime, so.
I have a quick question.
Yes?
Do you have, what length? Do you kind of have a specific length you shoot for?
Yeah, so when I set out to do this, I was like, we gotta do 20 minutes. Like, nothing is worth listening to if it's not at least 20 minutes. I listen to things that are an hour or more. I struggle getting a 10-minute episode, and I feel like I've got pages and pages, and I record, and it's 10 minutes with the interview sound bites. So that was something else as we went along that we realized we did not want to put a minimum or maximum on our episodes. It was going to be what it was going to be depending on the topic, the interviewees that we had. Like that top 10 one I showed you, that was like, the best one for that certain quarter. I think it was 10 minutes long. The most recent top 10 I did, I think, was 7 minutes long. But I think my very first episode was something like 40 minutes long. I think, depending on the topic, it's just going to vary. I don't think it's wrong to set like a minimum maximum. That's something else that you can give to your listeners that they can depend on. Like, I'm going to invest 20 minutes in this, this podcast today. But for us, it wasn't reasonable to set any sort of cap. And we don't really have anything that shows us that people tune out based on the length. It seems more that they're interested in certain topics. So, those are the questions. Yes.
Have you looked into artificial intelligence to narrate the transcript, not for the interview, but perhaps for the storytelling? We've tried we've actually implemented text to audio on certain blogs that we've done.
Oh, cool.
And the cool thing about that is that you can auto translate that to different languages.
Oh, that's really
And
neat.
if you need to go back, it's easier to make changes too.
Yeah. No, we haven't looked into that, but that's something I'll take back, because I don't have to hear myself anymore.
Adobe Premiere does a pretty good job if you use their caption technology.
Yeah, we've started, we've used them a couple times for transcriptions. Yeah, Premiere. So if you have access to something like that, it might transcribe or do auto narration. So.
Decrypt is another one I've heard a lot of people will
Okay.
use as well for their
Okay.
accessibility.
Awesome. Thank you. Got along. Yes.
So you said you use a third party to push the podcast
Yeah.
out. Is that just so you don't have to go to each individual place where the podcast is to do it, or do they do anything else?
So since we are a federal agency, the terms of service agreements are sometimes difficult to sign. So for example, some platforms, they will not amend their terms of service agreements for federal agencies. So like we couldn't sign up directly with certain platforms, but a third party, they have their own agreements with the platforms, and we amended a terms of service agreement with a third party that now has a government terms of service agreement for others who want to do this. So that was kind of our legal counsel's way of letting us be on all these platforms, but still fulfilling our legal obligations. It is also kind of nice to have it because yes, you don't have to have accounts. You don't have to go into every single one. You literally just go in and it has a list. It's like, where do you want your show to go? Boom, 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 and it goes out. The services like that also kind of, they're their own listening platform, so it's another place that people could potentially find their show. And that's actually the link we often push out on social media is that platform, because when you go to the link for that particular platform, it shows you all the different places you can listen to it. So we're not kind of like being biased by only saying like, here, listen on Apple, here, listen on Spotify. Or we don't have to post 10 different tweets about all the different places you can listen to it. So it was a necessary solution to a legal hurdle. Which, not the cutest answer, but.
Legal never is.
No, I know. You guys know I work, so it's all about that sort of thing. So. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much. I know it's lunchtime, so go enjoy. Thank you. I really appreciate you coming. Like I said, it's something I'm really excited about. So, whatever you do, whether it's a podcast or not a podcast, I hope you took something, you got a take-home message out of this, and that maybe you're inspired to try something new. So, thank you again.
Thank you.